Hi, my name is Cami Stanley, and I am a tour guide and the social media coordinator at the Reeves Museum here in Dover, Ohio. Thank you for joining us today as part of Tuscarawas County Museum's history-making collaboration. Today, I am standing at the grave of William Clark Quantrill, whom some call the Terror of the West or the bloodiest man in American history. But how did he get these names? William Clark Quantrill was born July 31st, 1837, to Thomas and Caroline Quantrill. Quantrill's father opened a tin shop shortly after moving to Dover in 1836, a year before Quantrill was born. His father was a learned man. In 1849, he became the assistant principal of Union School, which housed all the grades in Dover. A year later, he was promoted to principal, and a year after that, in 1851, Thomas Quantrill became the second superintendent of Dover schools. Both of his parents kept busy, his mother taking care of Quantrill and his siblings, and his father with his commitments at the school. Being the oldest, Quantrill was often asked to help care for his siblings, but whenever he was able, he would go off to the woods to practice target shooting. It was said he was quite good. Stories began to develop of Quantrill and his cruelty to animals. Dover was a farming town in the 1840s and 50s, so most families had their share of animals. It was said Quantrill would shoot pigs through their ear just to hear them squeal. A neighbor at one time also lost their beloved cat. They searched all night with no luck. A few weeks later, the neighbor found his cat hanging dead on a wall in the Quantrill family shed. He accused Quantrill, but Caroline, Quantrill's mother, denied that he could do such a thing. Quantrill followed in his father's footsteps and became a teacher at Union School at the age of 17. Shortly thereafter, his father died and Quantrill was left as the sole provider for his family. He left Union School for unknown reasons after only one term and went to Brandywine School, at which he also stayed one term. Quantrill was anxious to leave Dover, even though the community was growing with the help from the canal which had a stop in Dover. Although his mother was poor with young children at home, she encouraged Quantrill to find his way. He moved to Illinois where he taught school for a term. Then he moved to Indiana where he again taught for a term. In a letter to his mother dated February 21st, 1856, Quantrill says,
I am now in Indiana near Fort Wayne teaching a school, and a very good one I have. I have from 35 to 40 scholars every day. I have gotten a good neighborhood, and they say I am the best teacher they ever had. I get $20 a month and boarded. I took up school for 3 months, and my time is half out now.
He continues on to say it was a mistake to leave home and that he plans to return. He did return to Ohio, but not Dover. He went to Yorksville to teach, but when the opportunity to go to Kansas with 2 men from Dover came about, he left his family and unpaid room and board in Yorksville behind. Quantrill agreed to help these men farm their land in exchange for traveling companions. Once in Kansas, Quantrill claimed his own small bit of land, even though he wasn't 21, but he never intended to farm this land. Instead, he sold it for $60. Around this time, the men Quantrill had traveled with were starting to feel that he wasn't holding up to his end of the agreement. Quantrill felt trouble was coming, so he left and found a home with another group of Doverites who had come to Kansas. Former classmates of Quantrill's, the group lived in one cabin while building on other areas of the land. They called their settlement Tuscarawas Lake in honor of the county that they were all from in Ohio. Over time, the settlers of Tuscarawas Lake started noticing items that were missing: blankets, provisions, clothing, and a pistol. These belongings were found with Quantrill's things. Since he was a friend, he was asked to leave, and no legal action was taken. Quantrill went to Fort Leavenworth in Kansas, where he took a train to Fort Bridger in Utah. He wrote this to his mother.
I am again seated to write a few lines, which I should have done some time ago, but it was not in my power to do so any sooner, on account of my having what is called mountain fever, a dangerous disease which debilitates a person very soon, but once having broke the disease, a person gains very rapidly. For the last 2 weeks I have had such an appetite as hardly could be satisfied, but I am careful not to eat too much. I feel very well at the present. The Mormons have treated me very well, much better than I could have expected after their disturbance with what they called the Gentiles. Next week I'm going to clerk for the quartermaster in the army at $50 per month, which is no more than $25 at home. I am so nervous that I cannot write worth a cent. I can't tell when I will be home. I am not coming home without some money. I will take care of myself. Give my love to all.
There's no record of Quantrill pursuing the position of clerk. He seems to have spent this time gambling, during which he used the name Charlie Hart. After trying his luck at the Pikes Peak gold rush, which didn't go as he had hoped, Quantrill then headed back to Kansas. He moved to Lawrence, where he lived on a Delaware reservation. Posing as a spy for the Delaware, he was actually finding opportunities for himself. He became an anti-slavery agent, but was playing both sides. Quantrill would help arrange the escape of a slave from Missouri into Kansas and would then help the owner catch the runaway, for a fee. He wrote a one-sided case in this letter to his mother.
You have undoubtedly heard of the wrongs committed in this territory by the Southern people, or pro-slavery party, but when one once knows the facts, they can easily see that it has been the opposite party that have been the main movers in the troubles, and by far the most lawless set of people in the country. They all sympathize for old J. Brown, who should have been hung years ago. Indeed, hanging was too good for him. May I never see a more contemptible people than those who sympathize for him. A murderer and a robber, made a martyr of. Just think of it.
Quantrill then got involved with a group of border ruffians stealing, kidnapping, and horse stealing. Perhaps Quantrill sensed that his crimes would eventually catch up to him, and he would need to leave Kansas when he wrote this last letter to his mother.
I will here say that I will be home anyhow, as soon as the 1st of September, and probably sooner by that time I will be done with Kansas.
Perhaps one of Quantrill's worst acts pretending to be an abolitionist was the Morgan Walker raid. The plan was Quantrill and his group would go to the Walker plantation in Kansas to free the slaves there. It was the job of the 3 refugee slaves that were part of Quantrill's group to convince the Walker slaves to run. Quantrill's real plan was to sell the 3 men back into slavery. He told the group that he was scouting the land and went ahead of them. He went to Walker's house and warned Andrew, Morgan Walker's son, that the Kansas Jayhawkers were coming to rob his father's house. Quantrill and Andrew made their own plan. The next day, when Quantrill and his men got to the Morgan plantation, Quantrill went into the house to get the Walkers. While he was inside, his men were ambushed. 1 was killed and 2 wounded before the group escaped. The 2 injured men were later found hiding and murdered. After this, Quantrill had to forget being an abolitionist and fully support slavery. He needed a story to explain his involvement in the Morgan Walker raid. He said he and an older brother were going to California when they were attacked by Kansas Jayhawkers who killed his brother and left him wounded. An Indian found him and cared for him. To get his revenge, he said he joined the Kansas military organization many of the Jayhawkers belonged to. He had killed all his attackers except the men who accompanied him on the raid, and they would be killed on the counterattack with Walker. This is how he would get his revenge for his brother's death. Many felt this was a lie and wanted to hang Quantrill, but Andrew Walker convinced them to let him go. Quantrill left Kansas, never to return on good terms. Until 1862, the guerrillas in Missouri had no leader. Quantrill gained this position. The group started by murdering, looting, and pillaging the outposts of Union soldiers. This was done in the name of patriotism. The name William Clark Quantrill became a name to be feared. In March of 1862, the federal government declared the group outlaws. This meant they could expect to be shot or hung if captured. Other outlaws joined the group, and they grew to numbers over 100. In June of 1862, along with regular Confederate troops, they captured Independence, Missouri, a Union stronghold. Quantrill was made a captain in the Confederate Army and had over 150 men. Jim and Cole Younger and Frank James joined Quantrill's gang, and a year later, Jesse James joined. Quantrill and his gang burned towns and stole and murdered anywhere with Northern sympathizers. Quantrill rode to Richmond, Virginia, to petition for commission as a colonel. It is unknown whether or not this was granted, but he returned to Missouri claiming to be a colonel. On August 21, 1863, William Clark Quantrill's most infamous act was to unfold. Quantrill and his men were outside the town of Lawrence, Kansas in the early morning when, according to John McCorkle in his book 3 Years with Quantrill, Quantrill said,
"Boys, this is the home of Jim Lane and Jennison. Remember that in hunting us they gave no quarter. Shoot every soldier you see, but in no way harm a woman or child.
Those in the town were robbed, and almost all the buildings were burned to the ground. The town was said to be unrecognizable, and many families suffered as men were targeted. Jim Lane and Charles Jennison, the abolitionists who were being targeted, both hid in a field and survived. After the raid in Lawrence, Quantrill's raiders, as they had become known, started to dwindle in numbers. Some believe this was because of Quantrill and his lack of leadership. This may have been partially due to the death of his horse, Charlie. Quantrill got Charlie in Independence, Missouri in 1861. Charlie was wild, and only William could handle him. After the Lawrence Massacre, Charlie was being shooed. He fought hard and injured himself so badly he had to be put down. After hearing about Charlie, Quantrill said,
"That means my work is done, my career is run, death is coming, and my end is near."
While resting on a farm, Quantrill and his men were attacked. Shot and severely injured, Quantrill was taken to a military hospital in Louisville, Kentucky. William Clark Quantrill died on June 6, 1865, 54 days before his 28th birthday. 5 days before his death, Quantrill joined the Catholic Church. Worried about dying, Quantrill gave his entire fortune, $800, to the priest. He asked that part of this be used for his headstone and the rest given to Kate King, his mistress for several years. Note that nothing was given to his mother. Quantrill did not get a headstone. The priest feared it would be desecrated, so the money was given to Kate King. It is said she used the money to set up a brothel in St. Louis. Quantrill's remains were buried in St. John's Cemetery in the Portland area of Louisville, Kentucky. 22 years later, W. W. Scott, newspaper editor and publisher of Dover's Iron Valley Reporter and a classmate and friend of Quantrill's, accompanied Quantrill's mother, Caroline, to Kansas to identify Quantrill's remains. She was able to positively identify his remains because of a tuft of blonde hair and a chipped tooth. Caroline didn't want Quantrill's bones returned to the grave in Kansas, but returned to Dover. Scott tricked the caretaker of the cemetery and smuggled the bones back to Dover. But Dover City officials didn't want him. The Grand Army of the Republic did not want him in a cemetery where Union veterans were buried. It was agreed the grave would be unmarked and no announcement would be made. A private burial with Caroline, the minister, Scott, Charles Clark, and a cousin from Carrollton was held. W. W. Scott secretly kept the skull, shin bones, and right arm bones and hid them at the newspaper office. He was actually trying to sell the bones while Caroline was getting permission to bury her son. Scott tried to sell the skull to the Kansas Historical Society, but they weren't interested. In 1888, Scott traveled to Kansas and gave the shin bones as a gift, but again they refused to buy the skull. Between 1888 and 1903, the bones stayed on the second floor of Scott's print shop. He planned to try to sell the bones again after Caroline's death, as she was 18 years older than he was. But in 1903, Scott died from a heart attack a few months before Caroline. The skull ended up with the DJS Club. Fraternal organizations were very popular at the time, and the DJS Club was started by boys 13 to 16 years old and was associated with the Alpha Pi fraternity. The skull was used for the fraternity's secret ceremony. How did the fraternity get the skull? Members of the fraternity were friends with Scott's son and used to play outside the building where the skull was hidden for many years. Scott's son had no interest in keeping the skull. It stayed with the group until 1942. When the fraternity disbanded, trustee Nelson McMillan took the skull home and kept it in his cellar. It was brought back out for a 50th anniversary banquet. Money was collected at this time for a future banquet. Interest in the group was lost, so the $150 collected for the next banquet and the skull were donated to the Dover Historical Society. It remained there until it was buried in the 4th Street Cemetery in Dover, Ohio. Before the burial of the skull, the Dover Historical Society, in conjunction with Kent State University, made a mold of the skull. This mold remains with the Dover Historical Society in the carriage house of the Reeves Museum to this day. Thank you for joining us today. Check back Monday through Friday as we share videos from the Denison Depot Railroad Museum, Historic Zora Village, the Tuscarawas County Convention and Visitors Bureau, and the Age of Steam Roundhouse Museum as part of Tuscarawas County Museum's history-making collaboration. Stay safe, and we hope to see you soon at the Reeves Museum.